Today is January 11th, 2025, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. In my studies today, or yesterday actually, I came across a book written by an author. I believe his name is pronounced Abelson, Abelson, a book published back in 1906 titled The Seven Liberal Arts, a Study in Medieval Culture, published by the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York. And the opening chapter of this book is titled The Development of the Curriculum of the Seven Liberal Arts. And it provides what I think is a pretty simple and helpful history of the development of the classical liberal arts curriculum. And I thought what I might do for those who like to listen to my talks, usually while they're driving or working or doing chores, things like that, I thought I'd just read this chapter because it provides a helpful history. And I think it's pretty easy to listen to, and I posted the text on the Academy website, so if you'd like to take some time later on and read through it more carefully, you can do so. So I'd like to read this opening chapter to this book, The Seven Liberal Arts by Abelson, published in 1906. And again, the title of this first chapter is The Development of the Curriculum of the Seven Liberal Arts. So here we go. Hope you enjoy this. The question of the historical development of the curriculum comprising the seven liberal arts has received very little attention from scholars. Remember, this was written in 1906. The available sources at hand are meager, and the opinions of the authorities conflicting on many interesting questions. On the chief point, however, all are agreed, namely, that historically, the cycle of the seven liberal arts in the Middle Ages was an outgrowth of the ancient Greek and Roman systems of education, that from the Greek and Roman course of study, modified by the introduction of Christian ideals of education, the curriculum of the Middle Ages was gradually evolved. In the present chapter, this development and adaptation will be briefly traced. So the argument of the author here in this opening chapter is that the medieval system of education was an adaptation of the ancient Greek and Roman system of education, which adds some significance and weight to medieval Christian education because it's not something that was dreamed up by Christians, not something that's faith-based, but it's something much more deeper and permanent, stable, valuable, and so on. It is a truly human system of education that extends beyond the limits of Christianity and yet at the same time can be harmonized with the dogmas, the faith and morals of the Christian faith. And we're going to study the history of that development in this reading. In earliest times, Greek education consisted of the study of music and gymnastics. With the development of Greek life and thought, the subject of music was broadened to include poetry and letters. Plato's ideal scheme for the higher education of the quote-unquote guardian class, if you've ever read The Republic, contemplated a complete course in what we should call elementary, secondary, and higher education. I want to comment and just say, don't get these three divisions of education confused with modern schools. Just because it says elementary, secondary, and higher education, you'll notice in a minute that he talks about the ages of these studies, and they don't align with modern education. The elementary education, gymnastics, music, letters, that is grammar, was to last until the 20th year. Elementary education in gymnastics, music, and letters or grammar was to last until the 20th year. Secondary education, lasting from the 20th to the 30th year, was to embrace science, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and musical harmony. The higher education, from the 30th to the 35th year, was to consist of the study of philosophy as a final preparation for the practical life of the ideal citizen. And again, this is in Plato's philosophy. In the first two divisions of the course, we have a possible foreshadowing of the future separation of the curriculum into the trivium and the quadrivium. That's the system of Plato, education as it was viewed and recommended by Plato. Aristotle's curriculum, which was to serve as a foundation for higher studies, consisted of, first, reading and writing, second, gymnastics, third, music, and sometimes drawing. He too considered gymnastics and music important branches. Aristotle's ideas on education, as they have come down to us, are very fragmentary. There is no evidence to support the theory that he placed grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy in the preparatory curriculum of Greek education, as has been asserted. From the text of Book 8 of Aristotle's Politics, which is the only source on Aristotle's educational ideas, it certainly does not appear that these subjects of Plato's advanced curriculum of higher studies also formed what has been called, quote, Aristotle's program of secondary education, unquote. In the absence of any definite statement by Aristotle as to his views on the subject, it would be fair to assume that they agreed in the main with those of Plato, with the exception perhaps that his plan for the scientific training of a man would call for more natural science than mathematics. But even these quote-unquote scientific studies, whether mathematical or biological, were never considered part of the secondary curriculum to be studied before the Greek boy had reached the Ephebian age, or the age of young adulthood. Set over against these quote-unquote scientific studies were the quote-unquote practical studies of the sophists. Their ascendancy made rhetoric and not natural science the essential subject of the higher education of the Greeks. One of the effects of this change was that some study of mathematics had to be introduced into the preparatory curriculum, since the value of mathematics to the Greeks was considered very great. Thus we find that in the 3rd century BC, the preparatory work of the Greek young man consisted of a study of the following subjects. First, gymnastics. Second, grammar. Third, music. Fourth, drawing. Fifth, arithmetic. And sixth, geometry. The last two being distinctly mentioned as more advanced studies, that is, arithmetic and geometry. Here again, we have a foreshadowing of the distinction between the trivium and the quadrivium, the division of later periods. We find no further record of changes in the Greek curriculum of the liberal studies until the 1st century of the Christian era, the 1st century AD. So from the time of Plato and Aristotle, this is my comment, take a break from the reading for a minute, from the earliest time of classical Greek education through Plato, through Aristotle, and into the time of the sophists, even though there were changes through times, there was a clear development of what we will call the classical liberal arts curriculum later in Christian history. So that's where we've walked through so far, seeing that the subjects that were studied were divided into different phases of life with different purposes. We see the core studies of the seven liberal arts developing and being organized by the ancient Greeks, but we also see other studies like gymnastics, drawing, music, and so on, which are more practical. So an interesting combination of practical and contemplative studies. Let's continue the reading here. In the works of Philo Judaeus, who lived around 30 AD, around the time of the death of our Lord, Philo Judaeus, or Philo the Jew, there are frequent references to the encyclical liberal arts. He includes in his list all those that were current 300 years before his time, that's going back to the time of Aristotle, except for drawing and gymnastics. He adds, however, Philo, that is, adds rhetoric and dialectic. All these studies are spoken of as preparatory subjects and are clearly differentiated from the higher study, which is philosophy. Philo does not mention astronomy in his catalog of preparatory subjects. It should be noted here that while the works of Plato and Aristotle on education are theoretical plans, they represent essentially the practice of Greek education in their day. For preparatory education, the subject under discussion, Plato and Aristotle appear to have adopted in toto the prevailing Greek ideas of the time. And I'd like to just comment on this for a minute. It's really important for us to understand the development of Greek philosophy between the time of Plato and Aristotle. We can say, well, Aristotle didn't write much about education in and of itself, but that's really not true. Aristotle's works were the textbooks for study. They are the textbooks. They are the arts and sciences to be studied. So he didn't necessarily write books about education, but he wrote the textbooks of true classical education. Remember also that Plato was not an early philosopher and then Aristotle just a later philosopher. The science or the art of reasoning was not known in the time of Plato, but was discovered by Aristotle in the next generation. So when we look to the education of Plato, of course we're not going to see the arts of rational philosophy. We're not going to see the art of reasoning formally studied in the time of Plato because he didn't know it. It was discovered by Aristotle. This is one of the reasons why I always argue that Christians should spend a lot less time studying Plato. He didn't know the art of reasoning. It was developed by Aristotle in the Organon. So when we look at the Organon, which is the collection of Aristotle's works on the art of reasoning, we have for the first time in human history the textbooks, as it were, of the art of reasoning or logic. So there's an important philosophical achievement in the life of Aristotle that would necessarily change education forever. We can't just treat Plato and Aristotle or any of the pre-Socratic philosophers as if they're just earlier philosophers who differed in some superficial opinions about the subjects of philosophy. There was a significant, a radically world-changing discovery by Aristotle in the art of reasoning that would forever change human education. So it's important to note that historical development. It's not just an evolution, it's a radical discovery by Aristotle in the 4th century before Christ. So returning to the reading here, in the first half of the 3rd century BC, so around 250, up to 250 BC. We find a writer alluding to first grammar, second rhetoric, third geometry, fourth arithmetic, fifth astronomy, and sixth music. So we see 6 of the 7 liberal arts mentioned in the 3rd century before Christ. They're mentioned in such a way as to leave no doubt that the writer speaks of them as liberal arts. Dialectic, according to him, was then still considered a higher study. In Greece, then, it would appear that after the period of Alexander the Great, remember Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, a year before Aristotle, his teacher. Alexander was a student of Aristotle. It would appear that until after the period of Alexander the Great, there were only 3 or 4 preparatory studies in the curriculum. Letters, which always signifies grammar, music, gymnastics, and drawing. That with the growth of knowledge, more subjects like dialectic and mathematics were added to the curriculum, and that in this way, gradually, there came to exist in free Hellas, or Greece, a cycle of studies which were considered the minimum of liberal training for the average free man. So we have this development of the liberal arts curriculum through the time of Alexander the Great. Although the number of these was not definitely fixed at this time, at least 6 of the 7 subjects, which later constituted the medieval curriculum, were studied in the 1st century of the present era. So we see the development, this is a comment, we see the development of the 7 liberal arts curriculum coming together one step at a time, especially during the time of Aristotle and Alexander. And it's important to note the time of Alexander because that's what's called the Hellenistic period, when Alexander went on his worldwide conquest and brought this Aristotelian philosophy and education and culture everywhere he went. So in God's providence, the development, the discoveries of Aristotle in education and philosophy just happened to come to be at the time when Alexander went and conquered the whole world and brought that education with him, which created the philosophical context into which Christ would come in the 1st century. When we think about what the Bible means when it talks about Christ coming in the fullness of time, we can look at Jewish prophecies and expectations of the Jewish people, the messages of the Old Testament prophets, and so on. But we've also got to look outside of Israel at what's going on in the profane world, what's going on among the Gentiles or the pagans. And as the prophecies of the Old Testament are being fulfilled in time in Israel, we've also got human philosophy coming to its peak outside of Israel under the influence of Aristotle, the great philosopher, and then being carried from Greece all throughout the Middle East into Africa and the Far East by Alexander the Great. So we've got to see that the time of the coming of Christ and the founding of the Catholic Church was within the context of this development of the 7 liberal arts and their spread throughout the world. It's the reason why the apostles wrote the New Testament in Greek. It had to do with this Hellenistic period brought about by Alexander the Great, who again was a student of Aristotle. So this development of at least 6 of the 7 liberal arts was already in place by the 1st century of the Christian era. And we can see the medieval scholastic curriculum coming together hundreds of years before it would really become famous in Europe under the influence of the scholastics, which we'll get to in a little bit. Let's get back to the reading now. Passing on to the Romans, so moving from the Greeks to the Romans. Passing on to the Romans, we find that only after the Second Punic War, so I think that puts us around the time just before Caesar and Cicero. Cicero, I know, was born in 106 BC, so let's say later 2nd century before Christ, if you know the history. Passing on to the Romans, we find that only after the Second Punic War did Rome begin to adopt Greek ideas of education. After the first period of innovation, during which the education of young Romans was conducted by Greek teachers in the Greek language, strong efforts were made to establish a national literature and a national education, that is a truly Roman, a truly Latin education and literature. So they associated education in the later Republic period. They associated education in Rome with Greek education. The teachers were Greek, the language was Greek, and we see this in Cicero's writings. For example, Cicero's son was sent to study philosophy in Athens. You can see how the Romans of the Republican time, of the late Republic, the Romans, when they thought of what it meant to be educated, they thought it meant to be Greek, to be Hellenized, to learn the Greek system of education. But as time went on and as the identity of the Roman people developed, as they identified their own national identity, they wanted their own literature. They wanted their own educational system. And so what happened, as we'll read here in a minute, is that the Romans began to translate the Greek works on philosophy and education into Latin, and a Latin educational tradition developed. So let's keep reading the history here. This period marks the beginning of textbooks written in Latin. Varro, who lived in the 2nd and 1st century before Christ, who was a contemporary of Cicero and Julius Caesar, Varro attempted, in common with them, with Cicero and Caesar, to build up a system of education based on Greek ideas, but in which Roman and not Greek literature should be the basis. To further his objects, Varro wrote treatises on all the subjects taught in Greece in his day, but omitted drawing and included astronomy. His work, which is now lost, unfortunately, it's worth digging after, but it says that it was lost. His work was entitled Disciplinarum Libri Novem, or the 9 books of the disciplines or of the sciences, Disciplinarum Libri Novem, and contained treatises on grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, geometry, arithmetic, astrology, music, medicine, and architecture. So Varro recognized 9 different arts. I'll read them again. Grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, geometry, arithmetic, astrology, and music, and then medicine and architecture. So the 7 liberal arts plus medicine and architecture. And again, this is the work of Varro in the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ. The books were undoubtedly written for secondary schools, which were at this time already differentiated from the higher rhetorical schools. The practical secondary curriculum of the day was grammar in its narrow sense, and also literature, arithmetic, geometry, and music, a repetition of the Greek curriculum of the 3rd century before Christ. So it's important for us to see that Roman education in its golden age, in the time of Varro and Cicero and Caesar, the late Republic, as we move into the time of the founding of the empire, was really seeking to copy the educational tradition of the Greeks and simply Romanize it. So it was the same system of education, the same set of 7 liberal arts, simply brought into Roman civilization, into Latin language, and so on. Seneca, the philosopher, the Stoic philosopher who lived in the 1st century AD, Seneca, an authority for his age on matters pertaining to our subject, did not limit the number of secondary liberal studies to 7. In fact, Seneca's idea as to what constituted the circle of liberal studies seemed to have been very indefinite. Now it is grammar, music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. Now he speaks of medicine as a liberal art. Again, he plainly considers rhetoric and dialectic as higher studies, and hence a part of philosophy. Nor does Quintilian, who also lived in the 1st century of the Christian era, nor does Quintilian seem to have had any conception of 7 liberal arts. To be sure, he speaks of the preparatory training given by the Grammaticus as affording the Greek enkyclia paideia, or circle of studies, circle of education. But the cycle of preparatory studies which his model student of oratory was to master consisted only of grammar, a little music, geometry, and astronomy. Even these, with the exception of grammar, were to be studied in a superficial manner. This was all the instruction given until the 16th year of the boy's age. So in the time of the 1st century AD, Roman education was very light for the younger years and then got more intense around age 16. Now, it's worth noting, I'll just note this as a side comment, that Quintilian does say in his work on the education of the orator that education should start as young as possible. And I think he even mentions starting at age 5. So there's a difference between what these men would actually recommend for an ideal situation and what was common in Roman culture. So far then, getting back to the reading, so far then we are even further removed at this time from the 7 liberal arts than we were at the end of our survey of the Greek period. So Roman education became rather shallow and moved away from a very strict view of the 7 liberal arts. Apparently, the influence of Varro had been of no avail. Even though he was, among the greatest of educators, he didn't seem to be very influential. His work had been of no avail to make permanent the curriculum which he had closely modeled after the Greeks. His failure to establish in Rome a modified Greek curriculum was due to the fact that soon after his time, rhetoric and dialectic came to be considered advanced studies. The Roman secondary course, as compared with the Greek, which the Romans were plainly attempting to follow, was much briefer. In the first place, the period of secondary education in Rome was shorter, lasting until the 16th year of a boy's age, not until the 21st year, as in Greece. Then again, the Romans' character made them reject from the curriculum anything that was not of a practical nature. Therefore, the study of mathematics, in which the contemplative Greek delighted, was reduced to a minimum in the Roman course of study. It is only as practical studies that Quintilian advised the study of geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. It's worth noting there that this idea that mathematics should be studied only for practical purposes was explicitly criticized and refuted by Socrates in Plato's Republic. Back to the reading. The Roman schools, partially Hellenized, maintained their efficient and practical character for some generations after Quintilian, but a decline set in after the 3rd century, and this is talking of the Christian era, as the spirit of superficiality crept in. We see this in modern education and in the fake classical education. As the spirit of superficiality crept in, everything was sacrificed to the immediate practical needs of the time. Does that sound familiar or what? As the spirit of superficiality crept in, everything was sacrificed to the immediate practical needs of the time. Except in Gaul and Spain, where the racial characteristics of the Gallic mind encouraged the study of rhetoric and eloquence as the highest form of cultivation, the curriculum of the average Roman school contracted, and the grammaticus encroached upon the work of the rhetor or rhetorician, a result which Quintilian had foreseen. In this way, while there was a decline in the field of higher education, the work in the secondary school was enriched by the addition of the elements of rhetoric and dialectic. So we see rhetoric and dialectic being brought down into the lower school level. The curriculum of the Roman school of this period consisted then of a superficial study of the elements of grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So we see very explicitly here. Later in the Roman Empire, we see very clearly the 7 liberal arts, even though they're studied superficially. This undoubtedly was the accepted standard in the pagan schools at the beginning of the 4th century of the Christian era, the 300s. And just for chronology, just for reference, the 300s, we're talking about the time of church fathers like St. Jerome. The evidence on this point becomes very convincing when we consider that the latest researches as to the date of the work of one Martianus Capella, the work is titled De Nuptiis Philologicae et Mercurii, Martianus Capella. Capella, judging from the very little that is known of his life, could hardly have been a formulator of a curriculum. Hence, his work, which describes the content of the 7 liberal arts, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music in the order given, would seem to have represented the accepted standards of his time. So we can see that by this time, the 7 liberal arts are really becoming established. Wishing to write a poetic account of the liberal arts, he most naturally turned to the work of Varro, the Disciplinarum Libri Novem, as a model. To a provincial of Africa like Capella, Varro, a vir Romanorum eruditissimus, a man of who was most learned of the Romans, was certainly a sufficient authority to follow in matters of both style and content. Again, the work of Capella, like that of Varro, is divided into 9 books, although since the first 2 books form an allegorical introduction, the subjects treated are actually only 7. The assumption that he followed Varro absolutely in treating the content is thus supported by the similarity in form of presentation. Indeed, according to his own statement, Capella omitted medicine and architecture, the 2 other subjects included in Varro's treatise, only in order to keep within the mythological setting of his allegorical framework. So before we read that Varro, as much as he tried to bring Greek education into the Roman Republic, wasn't really successful in bringing it into the mainstream, making it common. But here we see Capella, a later Roman, basically taking the work of Varro and reintroducing it to Roman society. The 4th century, then, may be taken to represent the period when the curriculum of the pagan schools in the Roman Empire assumed a fixed character of a course in the 7 liberal arts. So this Roman system of education in the 7 liberal arts was really established in the 4th century AD, in the 300s AD. This century of social and political transformation marked the final stages in the evolution of a course of study which, through the medium of the public school, a characteristic institution of the later empire, not to be confused with American public schools. What the Romans called public schools, we would call private schools. It just means places where students gathered for studies, as opposed to private tutoring within a child's home. The public school proved perhaps the most effective means of preserving the classical culture of the ancient world. Notice the relationship between the study of the 7 liberal arts and the preservation of classical culture. But during the 3 centuries in which this pagan curriculum was thus crystallizing, it was viewed with suspicion by the Christian leaders, by the early church fathers. Throughout the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, men like Origen, Tertullian, and Jerome felt that these Roman schools were the most formidable opponents of the new religion because they were raising well-educated non-Christians. So the early Christian fathers saw these pagan schools as sources of trouble, opponents of Christianity. When one considers how much was at stake in the contest, the vehement denunciations of pagan education by these early church fathers becomes intelligible enough. So we can understand why the early church fathers were opposed to the pagan learning. It was actually the source of opposition for the early church. One example of an opponent of Christianity is the Porphyry, whose work on reasoning we study in Classical Reasoning 1 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Imagine having those men, those wise, virtuous pagans, being the men who you have to deal with in evangelization, those being the men raising arguments and objections against Christianity. They would be pretty formidable foes. And that's what the early church fathers had to deal with. So pagan learning, the classical liberal arts education, these pagan schools, as great as they were, by the early church fathers were actually seen as opponents to Christianity. But that would only last for a little while, as we're going to see. At the close of the 4th century, the end of the 300s AD, the close of the 4th century saw a decisive change. The triumph of Christian ideals was complete. So think, the close of the 4th century. So the conversion of Constantine was in the early 4th century. And as that conversion of Constantine and the spread of the acceptance of Christianity through the Roman Empire went on, the triumph of Christian ideals was complete. So the church fathers of the 4th century lived in a very different world than the church fathers of the earlier centuries in Christian history. The triumph of Christian ideals was complete in the 4th century. The decadence of the old education in nearly every part of the Roman Empire was marked as the decline of paganism. So with the fall of paganism, pagan education declined as well. Now that these schools no longer menaced the supremacy of the rising church, the merits of the old curriculum could be considered dispassionately by Christian leaders. In other words, once Christianity was firmly established and paganism began to decline, and the pagan schools and pagan education began to decline, and the Christians were free from that survival period of church history, they were able to look at the liberal arts curriculum. It says dispassionately, or without any emotion, without any opposition or contest, without any challenge from it, and look at it and judge it objectively and actually see the value of it and eventually adopt it as Christian education. The reading continues. It did not require much discernment to see that while the rhetorical subject matter of their instruction, literature, rhetoric, dialectic, was of real value to Christians as an aid in the study of theology. Such, in fact, was the prevailing opinion among the devotees of the new religion, even in the early period of strife with paganism. Even in the respective generations of Origen, Tertullian, and Jerome, the Christians had frequented these schools to a limited extent, and while a good Christian could not conscientiously become a teacher of rhetoric, it was not considered improper for him to study in pagan institutions. A good example of this respect for classically educated men can be seen in the writings of St. Augustine, who had direct experience in pagan education and always respected it. St. Augustine, in his writings, explained that if men come to the church from these pagan classical liberal arts schools, they should be easily and quickly admitted into the church because they're intelligent, they're reasonable, they're careful, they're thorough and discerning. And if they come, they've already sorted through the issues, they've already learned the Christian doctrine, and they can be trusted. So we can see St. Augustine really becomes the source of the acceptance of the classical liberal arts educational tradition in Christian history. We'll read more about St. Augustine in just a minute. Even in the respective generations of Origen, Tertullian, and Jerome, Christians frequented the schools, the pagan schools, to a limited extent. It was not considered improper for a Christian to study in a pagan institution. It would seem reasonable then that later, in the 5th century, or the 400s AD, Christians would not offer objections to the introduction of the 7 liberal arts of Capella as a part of a curriculum which was to be a preparation for the study of theology. The tendency to use the elements of pagan curriculum in Christian education was encouraged by Augustine himself, who was born in 354 AD and died in 430 AD. So Augustine spans the second half of the 4th century and the first half of the 5th century AD. He encouraged the use of the pagan curriculum in Christian education. He wrote treatises on grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, and music, 6 of the 7 liberal arts, 6 of the 7 subjects of the medieval curriculum. So Augustine explicitly wrote on the 7 liberal arts. His influence was potent in committing the church to a recognition of the arts, the liberal arts, as suitable subjects for Christian study. So we can see that embracing the classical liberal arts is really to follow St. Augustine. It's Augustinian. Augustine sought to prove his contention by recalling the biblical sanction which justified the plundering or despoiling of the Egyptians. Remember when the Jews, during the Exodus, took all of the gold and silver from the Egyptians, that despoiling the Egyptians, taking what is valuable from the Egyptians, that was used by St. Augustine in his writings to explain the process by which Christians take what is good from pagan philosophy and education and culture in general and put it to their own uses. Although he was not the originator of the curriculum of the 7 liberal arts, he, more than anyone else, made possible its general adoption by the Christian world of the West. With the support of such an eminent authority, it was but natural that the position of the secular liberal arts as a part of Christian education in the medieval curriculum should become secure. As far as is known, Cassiodorus, who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries, was the first Christian to use the term 7 liberal arts in his work De Artibus et Discipliniis Liberalium Literarum, a work designed to supplement his earlier work titled De Institutis Literarum Sacrarum. Again, these titles are in the printed text in the post if you want to see them. Cassiodorus supports Augustine's contention as to the necessity of the study of the liberal arts as preparation for sacred studies, and quotes biblical proof to show that the number of these studies must be 7. The text from Proverbs chapter 9, quote, "Wisdom builded her house, she has hewn out her 7 pillars," gave Cassiodorus conclusive scriptural authority for his views. That passage there from Proverbs chapter 9 is also quoted by St. Albert the Great later in history. This quotation from Proverbs is of significance. It means that at this time, Christian leaders admitted the necessity of incorporating secular studies into the Christian curriculum. And since these secular studies had been definitely 7 in number for over a century and a half, reasons were to be found from a Christian standpoint explaining scripturally that their number 7 was divinely sanctioned. With Cassiodorus, the number and the subjects of the medieval curriculum became definitely fixed. So here we really have in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, we have the fixing of the 7 liberal arts as the Christian curriculum. His authority, together with that of Augustine before him, was all sufficient to give to it that rigid character which it maintained for some 900 years. Their work marks the final transition of the pagan curriculum into the medieval world of letters. So if we wanted to consider 2 men to be patron saints of classical Catholic education, those 2 saints would be St. Augustine and St. Cassiodorus in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. From the time of Cassiodorus, the term 7 liberal arts is the regular expression for the round of preparatory secular studies. Isidore of Seville uses it as well as the terms trivium and quadrivium. So do Alcuin, Rabanus Maurus, and the later scholastic writers. Don't forget Boethius, and I think he lived in the 6th century. Later, so definite did this term become, the 7 liberal arts were not infrequently made the subjects of poems and paintings, even sculptures. Summing up the results of this inquiry, the following generalizations can be made. Number 1, in some 5 centuries of educational development, the Greeks evolved a curriculum of 7 liberal arts. The entire content of this curriculum was preserved for Rome in the Latin language by Varro. Second, this curriculum was adopted by Rome in part only during the period of the later Republic and the early Empire. Third, in the declining days of the empire, a marked reversion to the entire Greek curriculum took place, and its form and content were definitely fixed about the close of the 3rd century AD. 4. Christianity, triumphant, found it necessary to appropriate to its own use the content of this curriculum as a preparatory discipline for its higher study of theology. Fifth, having settled upon the fundamental proposition of the value of secular studies, the Christian leaders followed the line of least resistance, and adopting in toto the pagan curriculum then in existence, hallowed their choice by scriptural sanction, that is, by proving the value of the classical liberal arts by quoting scripture itself. And then lastly, sixth, the spirit of tradition, so characteristic of the period, was strong enough to maintain this curriculum in its rigidity throughout the Middle Ages. And that brings us to the end of this lesson on the development of the curriculum of the 7 liberal arts. And again, this reading was taken from the first chapter of a book by one Abelson titled The 7 Liberal Arts, A Study in Medieval Culture, published in 1906. And in the blog post on the Academy website, I have a link to an online source of that book if you'd like to see the whole book. So anyway, we read here the development of the curriculum of the 7 liberal arts. This largely agrees with what I wrote in my book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. This is another source on the same subject. There are a few points that I don't remember mentioning, which is one of the reasons why I'm studying at Harvard right now, because I'm doing this research to plan on revising and expanding that book on Understanding Classical Catholic Education. But I found this to be a relatively brief, relatively simple summary of the historical development of the classical liberal arts curriculum. So I hope that's helpful. Again, the text of this lesson is available on the Academy website, on the blog. This was published again on January 11th, if you want to look for the date of the article. But a helpful guide, a helpful history of the development of the classical liberal arts curriculum, which I recommend you read, and hope that you find the reading of this in this recording to be helpful. If there's anything you'd like to talk about with respect to this development in history, please feel free to get in touch. And just to conclude, I'd really like to draw attention to the truth of this in church history, that it was St. Augustine, one of the greatest, most influential, wisest, and best of the church fathers, who argued that true Christian education must be based on the secular 7 liberal arts. Very important for us to chew on that and really digest it. That this criticism of secular education, criticism of secular studies, and this sort of shallow Protestantish idea that Catholic education should really consist of an exclusive focus on Christian studies and Christian sources. That's not what the Church Fathers taught. And if we want to actually follow the counsel of St. Augustine and St. Cassiodorus and later on St. Isidore of Seville and the scholastic philosophers of the 12th and 13th centuries, we have to grow up a little and realize that these pagan philosophical studies that made up the ancient curriculum are necessary and valuable. And notice what they were argued to be useful for preparation for theological studies. Again, that's not my opinion. That was the teaching of St. Augustine in the 4th century of the Christian era. So I hope that's helpful. If there's anything you'd like to discuss, please get in touch. God bless.